Hooray!
Um,
Hey, Jesse.
Hey, Karen.
This is one of those great informal conversations that we talked about making sure that this robust American Love speaker series would do, right?
Yeah, I think it started um, thinking about this as like lectures online, and it's evolved into this conversation format. And I think it's just the best use of Zoom and our kind of being separated so much lately. It's a way for us to connect and have a talk rather than talk to somebody. So I love that we kind of have gravitated towards this naturally. It's great.
I love it too. And I want to welcome our audience. Thank you so much for tuning in to the second lecture, or I should say presentation of our Robust American Love Speaker Series. This is something new that we've planned. Again, something much more informal, free, open to the public, and we welcome your input. If you're tuning in live, that's fantastic. We're going to watch the chat and take your comments and questions and hopefully have time for them at the end. Jesse and I are really excited to be here, and we could not be here without Tristan Pullen in the background. Tristan, woo! He can't say anything right now, but he is the master puppeteer right now, enabling our conversation. So thank you so much, Tristan. Tristan is finishing up his degree down at the University of Memphis. We wish him much luck and on his impending marriage, of course, as well. And Jesse, should we say a few words about the series in general? I know we've got Jay Sherry coming up next week, which is really exciting. And we've got, actually, Tristan is also coming up very soon, talking about a play that he wrote about Whitman. Later in September, Brian Selznick, who many of you know as the invention of Hugo Cabret, author and illustrator, will be coming on board with me to talk about our recent book on Whitman's secret same-sex love poems called Live Oak with Moss. So please stay tuned for that. And just stay tuned throughout the fall. We're always here Thursdays, 6 to 7, irregular Thursdays, not every Thursday, but come as they come. And we're really excited to bring you fresh topics, new faces, nothing academic, just really conversations. And I could not be happier with today's discussion and my conversation starter here, Jesse Merandy, who is not only a very, very close friend and a dearly beloved comrade, but he's also the vice president of the Walt Whitman Initiative. And he's our tech guru. So without Jesse, none of this would happen. He's enabled the website. He's the one behind the whole Zoom speaker series. So Jesse, thank you on many, many levels for being here.
Thank you. And Karen, it's so funny as we embark on this kind of next chapter of the Walt Whitman Initiative. For those of you who don't know, we've been, doing a lot of groundwork on last year was Whitman's 200th birthday. And this year we've moved into a different phase of what we do. And we really kind of had these serious conversations about what we want, how we wanted to move forward. And I think that reaching out and creating ways to connect with people, provide resources for learning and ways to connect to Whitman that went beyond some of the more academic stuff we were doing, but also kind of focusing on the experience, and that meaning experiences of getting out in Brooklyn Heights, but also for educators and people who are interacting, thinking about how we connect to one another. So we really wanted to make a stress on education and thinking about what we could provide back to the community. So I wanted to, before we started, I'm going off my Karen. This is the first.
Oh my gosh.
First walking tour that I went on in New York City was with Karen, and that was 2005. And I just love, I was looking through all my Whitman ephemera and I found that, and I was very excited that wow, that was 15 years ago. So it's really, and kind of that kind of connection of with place and through the walking tour goes back to the beginning of our friendship. So I really thought that was a nice starting point to think about that.
I still remember, Jesse, when you were working on your PhD, and maybe you can tell everybody, I guess this is part of our conversation, but you created the first, I guess how do we phrase it? The first digitized dissertation? Is that what you say?
I've been referring to it as the first all digital dissertation because the components that I submitted, including the surrounding kind of the white paper that explained the project and went into the theory and the experience of building it and reflections on that experience, that was all submitted digitally. So typically you would print out your manuscript, your monograph, and print that out and bind it. And so I have, I have all mine was submitted through the library as a digital project. So the game was included in that, all of the, which we'll talk about more, but the game is called Vanishing Leaves. And it was a location-based mobile experience. And basically what it did was take the idea, the essence of the walking tour, and combine that with the amazing properties of our new mobile phones and try to make a kind of self-guided learning experience where the user could go to Brooklyn Heights, learn about Whitman, and kind of visit these places that were connected to him, or at least that I felt inspired by, that had a connection to Whitman. And also I created a narrative overlaying that game so that not only were you moving around Brooklyn Heights, but as you did that by yourself, you're solving a mystery of identifying and trying to stop this nefarious organization from eradicating Whitman from human memory. So it's got a kind of fantasy and fun, playful element to it that I was striving to create something fun that went beyond just the kind of reading of Whitman, but an experience where you're out there in Brooklyn Heights and you're trying to solve this puzzle. And, there's a lot of aspects that came out of that game that were just from like playing around and going out into Brooklyn Heights and exploring the neighborhood. And it's kind of goes back to, I was walking around by myself looking for things, but to do the tour with you really started to help me focus on what I wanted to identify as like, what are these places, these core kind of places in Brooklyn Heights that are either lost connections to Whitman or still existing connections. And that's another thing I was really interested in, is like, what's still there? What's not there? How hard is it to find Whitman in Brooklyn Heights?
So that's really our theme for the day, talking about not just the walking tours that we've done, but different ways of conceptualizing, bringing people there. And we thought it was just a really relevant topic now that we're in this COVID situation where many of us can't go out there and do the tours. So we'll talk about what we're missing by not doing that, but also with some of the things that Jesse's been trying. And I've also been trying some of these Zoom live virtual tours. It's a really interesting conversation about the importance of being there, right? And how we can simulate that through this medium that we're dealing with now. But before we get really deep and heavy into this, Jesse, maybe you can tell me, because I'm not sure I know the answer to this question. How did you get into Whitman from the start?
At Rutgers and Camden. No, I know it's going back a little bit, which is also another connection I have to, actually. And when I was doing my master's at Rutgers and Camden, which is where Whitman spent his final days, and his house is still remaining there. I was working with Tyler Hoffman at Rutgers Camden on the Mickle Street Review, which is an online journal that is dedicated to Whitman and American studies. And I was bringing that journal from print to an online kind of representation of it. And so we've been working on all these projects, and the more I had access to the Whitman House, and I think really what struck me, and I write about this in my white paper and my dissertation, was just walking through that house and like thinking about him being there, and like there's this tangible connection to him. And I really was like, there was a sadness in the house, of course, because that's where he ended he didn't end his life ended. But just seeing his bed, and there was this one moment, there's this chair apparently that was his, and his galoshes are on the ground right under the chair. And it was like, I thought about him like sitting there putting on those shoes. And it was kind of like that boot under the boot,
Yeah.
if you want me again, look for me under your boot soles moment. I was started to think about that, like other connections to him. And when I moved back to New York City after I finished my degree, it opened up that whole part of his life that was the beginning. Mm. So in a way, I kind of went from all the way from the end back to the beginning. And there's that part of Brooklyn, his connection to Brooklyn, which was so vibrant, and he was young and like exploring the world and open to everything. And before the Civil War and all the trauma and tragedy he saw, that was so vibrant and amazing. And how he spoke about New York City and having a connection to New York City my whole life, I really felt so inspired to learn more about him. What about you, Karen?
Yeah, I think for me too. And it always seemed to me that there was less attention paid to that Whitman, the pre-Civil War Whitman. And of course, we know the Civil War poems are incredible, right? The letters that he kept for the soldiers, the essays that he wrote. And a lot of people feel that he turned into a better and better poet as you went along. But I think for me too, there was something so raw and revolutionary about that young Whitman. And also, I guess, just because of my own Long Island connections, I was really interested in the beginnings, right? Like, how did America's poet come from such a humble background? And, I'm sure lots of people know these details that are listening to this, but we're talking about a grammar school dropout whose parents are barely literate, someone who never really belonged to a writing coterie. He was always kind of on the outside. He was non-heteronormative, never got married, just on the outside of culture. And yet this guy became so central. And it's always been my take on Whitman that New York made him great. Like, it was something about the city, something about the combination of the city and the access to Promenade, as he called it, or Long Island, that energized this pretty lousy penny daily reporter and, experimental poet who's doing a lot of kind of sad rhymed poems through the 1840s. And then he just sort of bursts into bloom in the 1850s. So that link between Whitman and the city, I feel like, is something that both of us have really sought to celebrate. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling I got into Whitman in grad school because I was at Columbia studying the British Romantics, and I just wandered into a class on Whitman and Dickinson. And I think his immediacy in New York really struck me. I was like, oh my God, he's right underfoot. Yeah. So, I know we've talked about this too, but I need to move. I love thinking, but I also love doing. And I love the idea of walking like Whitman did. And I've said to friends that Salvator ambulando, the Latin phrase meaning it can be done by walking, should just go on my gravestone, because there is something about, and it's counterintuitively such a New Yorker thing to just walk everywhere and think while walking and learn while walking. So I'm sure that a good deal of the reason that I got into Whitman was that accessibility and that energy and that vibrancy.
Yeah, I mean, I think people outside of an urban area like New York City take for granted how much we walk. And my wife's sister visited, and by the end of the day, she was like, I can't walk anymore. Her feet hurt because it's my tendency to show you everything on foot. I will walk you until you have nothing left to give. And that was really funny that day, because I was like, wow, we're conditioned. We just walk and walk. And and often with that walking experience, if I'm alone, I'm contemplating so many things, my life and the world around me, but also paying attention to all these things that happen around you in New York City. Things I miss, particularly when I walk around now during, the COVID pandemic. And even though we've recovered some, it's still, you notice the changes and it makes you appreciate some of those, the vibrancy that you live here for, and that you are, that's just so incredible.
And we should also mention that Whitman was very much in league with this type of thinking, right? He was maybe the city's first great walker, and people have written about this. But Whitman covered lots of ground in Manhattan as it was rolling up from the southern tip, and the grid was being laid. He experimented and wandered all over the city, and of course in Brooklyn too. Used to take the train all the way out to Greenport, and he wandered around the East End. So for Whitman, that mobility was also a big part of his life. The energy and the physicality really informed the poetry. So we're getting a lot of that energy from him too. Um, and I guess, but if I had to ask you a question, Jesse, like why then jump from walking to touring people? Like what is it about leading people around, not just you walking on your own, but just like bringing a group forward? What does that do?
Yeah, I guess, I think about this actually very differently. The game, I call it a location-based mobile experience. It has gaming properties, but it really is meant to be an experience. And one of the things that was a focus was actually to make a solitary experience something that somebody could do by themselves. Because I personally admired so much what you were doing as a walking tour guide, and other people have done as well. Greg, who we'll miss, was a great tour guide, Greg Trupiano.
Yeah.
So for me, that part, people were doing that so well. I wanted to create something that didn't need a guide. So part of it was actually trying to create an experience that that encouraged contemplation, introspection, and deep looking. Because that's another thing with the city, with so much going on, it's often hard to pause, stop,
Right.
Look around, and take stock, because we are so mobile that we're going from point A to point B with purpose often, and not with the kind of reflection in mid-journey. What are we going through as we move between those points? So I really was interested in kind of slowing down that process and giving pause, and built into the Vanishing Leaves project are cues, writing cues, to help kind of encourage that thoughtful contemplation and reflection as well. So I guess, though, I love the experience of walking with people. So you started doing these tours not in 2005, I'm sure before that. Why did you decide to bring other people to share what you knew with them?
I think I gave my first tour when I was a graduate student, and I was teaching my very first iteration of my Whitman in New York class at the Cooper Union. And I love teaching at Cooper. The students are brilliant. They're open-minded, and they only have three majors: art, architecture, and engineering. So there were no literature majors, but there were students that were so interested in exploring the city in very open, creative ways. So I think I started doing it just because I felt like I wanted to put a lot of my students in touch with New York. So I love what you do, Jesse, with, thinking about doing this without a guide. But for me, the tours have always been centrally located with people. So quite often when I take people on tours, we stop and go visit somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or as many of you know, if you go see a site or a house or a historic church, you actually need someone to take you inside and bring you inside, unless you're doing it digitally. So a great example for this for me is Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims. And I know you've led people in there, and this is part of your tour too, Jesse. But it's a magnificent, very storied church in Brooklyn Heights. Abraham Lincoln worshiped there. It's what's his name? Henry Ward Beecher was the preacher. Whitman was incredibly moved by how Beecher managed to attract so many people to this church, right? And Beecher was quite a flamboyant figure, held, for instance, mock slave auctions in kind of a sort of a backwards way to raise money against the slavery. But the church itself is such an amazing place to see. And part of what's really interesting about it is underneath the church is a very big basement that was used as a depot in the Underground Railroad. So for many years, I guess I really started these tours around 2000, 2001. There was an incredible woman there named Lois Rose Brooks. And Lois, if you are watching, we miss you. She retired, but for many years, Lois was the gatekeeper to these remarkable places inside Plymouth. And she would talk about Plymouth's history, but also take us downstairs. And someone like that, she's a volunteer, totally invaluable to people who are learning about history on the go in these tours. As I said, Lois retired now a few years ago, I would say 4 or 5 years ago. And unfortunately, there hasn't been someone there that has taken up that banner as she did. So when you're leading tours like I do, my intention is to connect people with people. But the problem is that you realize you're reliant on a lot of people to see things in a certain way. And I'll just say another instance of this for me is for my Whitman classes, I like to bring them into the Cooper Union, which also is a really storied building, that foundation building in Astor Place. Built by Peter Cooper in the late 1840s, an incredible structure. And one of the greatest things about it is the Great Hall, which is still used for big talks. They still have in the Great Hall the podium that Abraham Lincoln used when he gave his right makes might speech. I always think of that backwards, but it's right makes might, before he became president. And up until a few years ago, there was a gentleman that sort of, again, volunteered to take care of Cooper Union history, would let us in there. The students could actually stand at the podium, deliver something or get their photo taken. And that has also become a way of the past. But just back to what got me into this, I guess just a love, such a deep, deep, deep love of my hometown, and also of its incredible people, right? People who do things for free and volunteer. They love the culture. They bring people into these spaces.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that connection, I think that's one part of like this kind of, one of the parts about mobile devices that I wrestle with is that I hate parts of it and I love other parts of it. So the one part I don't like is that we do sometimes cocoon ourselves off from the world while we're absorbed in our devices. Either, you can see people walking with them. And part of me, what I love about the walking tours is you're free to have your head up. It was really like striking a balance there too, that I wanted to encourage stopping and not being embedded in the phone as the experience, but the experience was more of this embodied knowing, like you have to walk in Brooklyn Heights and look around to really start to think about what it was like for Whitman to live there. And that's part of like one of the most powerful parts of these kind of experiences where you go on these walks and walk around is that walking in those same footsteps to those same locations, even if radically changed, there is a connection to the human history embedded in those places. And even if we can't see it, we start to think about it and we can start to peel back those layers. And I know you talked about this as well, but this, like what mobile devices do so well is create an opportunity to like show you that history and peel back those layers. That when you're just walking around, you may walk right by, for instance, the Eagle Warehouse, the site of where Walt Whitman was an editor, and not even think twice. I mean, there's a plaque there, maybe you'll see it, maybe not, but to stop and think and to start to, look at resources, like images of old Brooklyn, and see those places. What I have really found, like even the tour, which I offer freely to the world, the experience of building it has been so extraordinary, because every time I found something, a connection, it forced me back into the books, into the archives, and then I would go back out, and then I would learn something new, and then I would go back in again. So there, for me, it's an incredible learning experience. Trying to create educational experiences for others has made, my understanding of those neighborhoods even deeper. And I have some great slides to show that we can get to too, because they're kind of like, Karen and I were like, we should show some pictures of Brooklyn Heights, or people are going to be like,
bored by our faces.
Some
Yeah, I've got
images.
slides too. Right, exactly. We can show those too. You want to show some now, or I really like talking about it.
Keep going. Yeah,
the difference between the digital experience and doing it live. And I'm hearing from you some very interesting points about how the city is in flux, right? So at the same time you're building a tour and you're taking people on a tour, the tour guide is always in the process of learning too. So I think for me, one of the great things about giving these tours year after year for now 2 decades is watching neighborhoods change, watching history actually take place. Just an example of this, I used to, at the end of my Ryerson Street pilgrimage, because I have a tour where I walk people basically from Flatbush Avenue Extension through Fort Greene Park, and then visit Whitman's last standing house in New York City, which is at 99 Ryerson Street. But now I end the tour right there in front of the house. But I used to go further back down to where the Navy Yard is. This is also big Whitman territory. His brother Jesse worked down at the Navy Yard. I'm sure Whitman checked out a lot of guys down there, just like always a busy place from the early 19th century on. And I used to go down to Admiral's Row. Jesse, did you see that area before it was knocked down?
That's not where the new Wegmans is.
That is exactly where.
I didn't get to go there before it was Wegmans. No.
There used to be a row of admirals' houses, like the top people, the top brass at the Navy Yard would get these gorgeous homes, and they were slowly over time deteriorating. They were kind of like sculptures, actually, if you think about it. And even though the fence and the gates and the walls kind of tried to obscure the view from the street, you could catch glimpses and take some really cool photos from the street. So year after year going down there, seeing how they were deteriorating and crumbling, and then getting into the political stuff behind the scenes, because there was a huge move to save them. And I think 2 were saved, but most of them went down for this Wegmans, which was actually needed in that neighborhood. But I feel really lucky in seeing that passage of time and that gentrification. You and I have talked a lot about that, but just walking people down to that Ryerson Street house through Fort Greene. And I still remember in the early 2000s, it was a much more dicey neighborhood. You had to really watch out. I felt more like a shepherd of my people that were walking with me. And now there are high rises going up. It's just a really different city. So there's something to be said for giving these tours, not just getting them, right? That you actually over and over again, you experience these ebbs and flows of New York City itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And Whitman in his own time, with this massive influx of immigrants from Ireland, from Germany, who were basically flocking to Brooklyn Heights to work in the docks, the population going from 40,000 to 100,000 in 5 years. I mean, he would walk around, and I remember a comment he made, something like, whoever thinks Brooklyn isn't changing hasn't walked around down, Atlantic Avenue, or I forget what street he was walking on, but I was struck by that. Like, he was walking and seeing the changes. Not only was he somebody who lived in these kind of on the fringes, kind of a figure in between, because I always love thinking about how he was in this neighborhood where, you know, we take for granted like sidewalks and streetlights and clean water, but he would write about those things just to bring to life this kind of this city that almost couldn't adjust fast enough to the amount of people who were coming into the city to live there. And I think change, it has become for me a kind of touch point. Every time I think about Brooklyn Heights in New York City, it's a city that if you hold dear to something, it will likely be gone, you know, in 10 years, 20 years, who knows, but things get replaced, torn down, built again. And that is kind of in the fabric of the city. And it's a shame, because many other cultures hold on to their beautiful buildings and their historic places. And New York has lost too many of those. I mean, we know that the Rome Brothers print shop where Whitman published the first edition of Leaves of Grass is gone. And we always lament, you know, now this was part of Robert Moses's grand scheme to make the city automobile friendly, was raising whole neighborhoods. And some of those neighborhoods include parts of Brooklyn Heights, which below the Borough Hall and into Codman Plaza were all lined with these beautiful, you know, brownstones and less, you know, fancy houses. But those streets, which we now still can visit at Brooklyn Heights, are so cherished, and you can imagine them stretching for another, you know, 4 avenues or such. And it's really shocking to see that. And even while I was building this tour, you know, the Brooklyn waterfront, from the first time I went down to the Fulton Ferry Landing, you know, there was warehouses to my left, these big Brooklyn warehouses lining the whole waterfront. And now it's hard to believe that warehouse, like neglected waterfront, has turned into this beautiful green space, parks, playgrounds, ball fields, shops. It's just incredible, and rolling hills. And so, you know, even as I was working on this project for 10 years, you know, so much changed in that neighborhood. It became unrecognizable down at the waterfront, and continues to change up and down from the Fulton. The Fulton Ferry Landing was like the first thing they did, fixed and relaunched with, of course, we know Whitman's words lining the outside of the pier, which is one of my favorite Whitman locations.
I've got pictures of that, and I know you have photos too. Do you want to pull out some of the photos while we talk? Because I see we're already at halftime, so we might as well show.
Share.
Yeah, please share.
You're gonna have to forgive me. I'm gonna skip some of my like game photos, but a lot of what we're talking about and mentioning is in the comments of the YouTube, or in the description of this YouTube stream. So you can visit my game there, and you can visit the resources we have that Karen has put together for walking tours, including her virtual walking tours, which she did just this past year. So those are fresh and ready to encourage you to get out on the streets again. So let me, I'm gonna start the presentation here, and I'm gonna click through some of these are just game photos. So I explain a little bit more about my game, but you can find this all in my white paper, so I won't dwell on it. But
we want to cover everything here, but go to the part that you want to show us.
Yeah, here we are. I think Karen and I had talked about how important, you know, the idea of the walk was to Whitman, and the many ways that influenced his life. The walk was so important, and I think it's hard to understand until you go walk about yourself, you know, and get an experience of walking in the city. You start to think about Whitman and what he was accomplishing through his walk. And part of those, and what I list here, is the walk not only connected him to place, but it was this kind of way for him to explore the city, especially as an editor in a lot of the different publications. He would write these long rambling, he would call them rambles, where he would just depart for the day and go walk and basically record everything he saw. He would interact with people, visit old businesses, lament the loss of other businesses, or he would pop out to the far reaches of the city where he could get lost in what was the countryside, which was not as far out as you have to go now to get to the countryside.
In fact, that Ryerson Street house, he talks about how, or it's one of the guests that went to the Ryerson Street house talks about how from the back windows, they could just see out to the water. So one thing we have to remember is that the city was a lot more green and empty when Whitman was exploring it. You know, there's a reason why he gravitated towards titles like Leaves of Grass, even though he was America's first true urban poet.
Yeah, the city and the country were
right
blended together. Well, I mean, there was a lot. At that time, you know, he would visit like the Crystal Palace exhibition, and that was on, you know, right below Central Park. And that was basically the cutoff of Manhattan. Up above that was also right farms. Yeah.
Where the New York Public Library stands right now, that was right there. And he loved to go out there, up there, I should say, walk on the top of the Croton Reservoir, which was built in a grand Egyptian style. And then right next to it, I guess where Bryant Park is, that's where the Crystal Palace was. I mean, that was a huge hub for him as well. So what are you going to show us some of his notes? I know you were talking about how he would walk and take these notes. And I'm going to stress this idea of Whitman learning from the city, right? The walking itself was an education, as it is for a lot of us. And I think in the photos that I assembled, which are mostly from my tours, so I'm going to embarrass some of my former students, but you know, just you can see on people's faces the beauty of being there, right? There is something to it. It's not just a romantic notion to think that being there makes a big difference. So whether you're there digitally or there live, that experiential learning, or I guess the other word for it is on-site pedagogy, right? That's something that I really go back to again and again when I'm teaching students, like bringing them there.
Okay, let me see if I can share this. I apologize if it.
Oh, this one. I love this little thing here, the City Walk.
Yeah, so this was my like one discovery as I was looking through his manuscripts, and somebody said it was his first thinking around crossing Brooklyn Ferry. It does mention the ferry in the end, but I loved this, you know, just the list of, it's this little note, you know, just the list of all that is seen in a walk through the streets of Brooklyn and New York and crossing the ferry. So yes, those are parts of crossing Brooklyn Ferry, fundamental parts of it, but also this just idea that I have an idea for a poem, you know, it's like the city walk. That's just everything I see. How simple is that? And I just love that, you know, he brought that to life in a way through this kind of like, you know, of course we see everything on video now, but like conveying the experience of this kind of panorama around you via words is something he does so well through his catalogs. And I think, you know, whether you love or don't love Whitman, to read his poetry where he runs these catalogs and is so descriptive about New York is transportive in a way that I find, you know, it brings the vibrancy and the kind of immediacy and the highs and lows of New York City and this urban center all to life. And so I love that about, you know, sometimes when he gets into these lists and he's just pointing out this boat and this steam ferry and that building, you know, you kind of get lost in his, it's like looking through his eyes. I love that.
I have to think about, for those of you familiar with Song of Myself, Whitman's section 33, which is by far the longest section of all 52 sections of Song of Myself. And it's almost completely a catalog, right? Just like a listing of this and then that, and then this and then that. And it's you either find it incredibly mesmerizing and you dive in, or you're just like, this is not a poem. What is that doing there? Of course, he's challenging the whole notion of what a poem is and what a poem should do. But what's extraordinary about that is that part lists things that you're supposed to be seeing around the country, but it's really inspired by Whitman's New York perambulations. He rarely left New York in his first 42 years. Before he went down to the Civil War front in 1862, I think Whitman left New York maybe twice or three times. One big trip down to New Orleans. But really, all of that stuff in Song of Myself, the first edition of Leaves of Grass, 1855 Song of Myself, that is inspired by the incredible variety, diversity, and energy of the city around him. So a little scrap like this reminds you that he's collecting always just from these perambulations to build the great American poem. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's so well put. Yeah. And it's funny to like read his early prose work he did as an editor, where he would walk up Broadway and take note of the shop fronts and go into a museum and then pop out and see an opera. And it's like it's like he did away with a lot of the superfluous kind of parts of that and just focused on like giving you as much as he possibly could of the world around him. And I think there's something like we can relate to that by just listing the kind of, he writes in Song of the Open Road about the windows and the doorsteps and how, everybody who's walked by and walked over those, walked through those doors has left something of themselves. And now that those very same things offer that history back up to Whitman, as he also invites you to do the same. And that's one thing I always loved about Whitman, is that he always encouraged you to do it for yourself, which is
right.
maybe the reason, like, I would go out and do these walking tours. He always would say, you can't take it from me. You have to go and live this. And you're not going to learn it from a preacher or a school book. Unless you go out and live this, you can't understand what I'm writing about, and you can't understand the world around you. So I love that, he just, whatever works in the classroom doesn't work under the open sky. And I love that he invites you along, take my hand and come with me and walk a while, he does that often.
Right. It makes it very easy to do Whitman tours, right? Like his poetry and his prose all lean towards that. I'm even thinking about how much we're emphasizing the outdoors, Jesse, because that's another great thing about Whitman, even though he is the consummate city poet, right? The first urban poet in America. He's all about going outside. And I think it's the second page of Song of Myself. He says, I am enamored of growing outdoors. And I always point out to my students, you want to say going outdoors, right? But
Yeah,
Whitman actually says, I'm enamored of growing outdoors. He just, like a plant, right? Like a tree in New York City. There's something that he gets from that city energy, even though most poets during his own time, the transcendentalists, are all outside up in Massachusetts, right? I'm thinking about Thoreau, celebrating nature's bounty. But Whitman found that going outside in the city was that locus that brought him what he needed to create this work. And I see you have, this is really fun, a really early image of that spectacular site that we all love so much, that downtown Manhattan view from Brooklyn Heights.
Yeah, I love going back to one of the other like amazing things of doing a project where you focus on a particular time is that you can never stay there. You either start drifting back further in history, or you start looking further into the present. And I've loved to do both. I've learned so much about this really amazing neighborhood, but I love these old prints where you can like see through Manhattan, and like the highest things mostly are trees till you can see New Jersey in the background there.
That's like the Trinity Church that you see right across the water, like above the biggest ship in the center. And I'm just kind of smiling at the rundown Dutch looking buildings here on the Brooklyn shore, because that's where that new hotel is, that is the polar opposite of what you're looking at right here.
And of course, this is well before Whitman was here, but I have some, this is more, this is
right when the Whitmans moved to Brooklyn. They actually lived down in this area. This is pretty near Dumbo. We're kind of at the tip where the Fulton Ferry Landing is, and he would have known this very well, this scene.
And this helps me to think about, as he, describes pigs in the street, no sidewalks, no lights, just they're like farmhouses. It's still even, a
Right.
barn and, this
was painted by Francis Guy, and Whitman actually writes about this in his series for the Brooklyn Standard. He loved this painting. And for those of you who want to see it when we're all back, to visiting museums, the Brooklyn Museum has it's incredibly huge. The canvas is a walk-in canvas, but apparently this was created by Guy from a camera obscura that he had in his window. So this is actually the scene that Francis Guy looked out on when he was living in the Dumbo area of Brooklyn in the early, I'm thinking it's 1819 or 1823, right around. Whitman came to Brooklyn in 1823 from Long Island. He's born in Long Island, 1819. But when he was 4, he and his family immigrated to Brooklyn and to this particular area.
And so just taking it up, this is late 19th century. And so, probably post-Civil War, but
Where is this? Do you know, Jesse, the street?
That's the corner building on Fulton Street.
Oh my God.
I believe it just has a really cool canopy over it. But this one really takes me back. Fulton Street is one of my favorite locations. I always think about it as this divider because on the, to the north was all of the immigrant families and this kind of sporadically, however they built as they would across, up towards, Greenpoint and Williamsburg. But to the south was the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood, which was manors and stately homes up on the hill overlooking Fulton Street. So there was this kind of, Fulton Street was like a divide between these two worlds. And the Eagle Warehouse, where the Eagle, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle's former home was right on the street. So Whitman would have walked right down here and, walked down to the ferry and seen all this, like these two worlds on either side of him. I always thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. And the other cool thing is how many words were in the street at that time. This is a point that Barbara Henry, my dear friend and master printer, always makes. But Whitman's New York was full of language, right? And the signs were often not just big, but they had different fonts. And I love the sign for the pianos up there, Wheeler and Wilson. I can't quite read the one on the corner building there, but there was so much to look at, right? And so much to read as you cruise through New York.
So this was my view of the first times I went down to Brooklyn Heights and down to the waterfront there. So you can see the big buildings. They were like, now that's
so sentimental about that. Yeah. Like people who know that, because I forgot about that big Brooklyn Works. I used to think that was so spirited, that Brooklyn Works sign. Oh my gosh.
So here's the now, it's just so radically different, but I love what it's becoming. Karen, one of the reasons is because of new places that get connected to Whitman, which is the Granite Prospect, where we hold the Song of Myself Marathon every year. And part of my location-based mobile experience takes you here to actually think about new connections. So I feel like Whitman's spirit has been imbued in this place through the great collection of people who have showed up year after year, braving storm and heat to read the entirety of Song of Myself on Whitman's birthday. So
until this year, when we went digital for the first time, thank you, Jesse. And for those of you that haven't seen it, check out our Walt Whitman Initiative YouTube site, because we have up there the Song of Myself Marathon. So the entire poem read by all sorts of different volunteer voices. Absolutely stunning. And the first time we can actually watch it again and again, because usually we're down here at the Granite Prospect, just doing it spontaneously around Whitman's birthday in May.
Here's one more picture of what that from the Brooklyn Promenade what the waterfront looked like.
That's so crazy.
I mean, it's so hard to imagine now when you're down there, but this is like just stacks of shipping crates, and
that's
I love the old
working,
cars.
right? Like it said, Brooklyn works. You've got the Promenade still on your right, so there's that. And of course, the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. But instead of having this lush Brooklyn Bridge Park that we're used to now, you can see Brooklyn still really working, right? Those are shipping containers.
So that's just the
right.
the before and after. So you could see, I mean, this is like, that's the change. That's a change I saw in my life in the time I was doing the project, to this bridge below, which is called Squib Bridge. Karen and I always talk about it as like the bane of my project existence, because part of the game took you over this bridge, which was fascinating. It was built like a trail bridge and it wobbled, and people would like not go on the bridge because it was wobbly. So I was like, all right, I'll create alternate paths to the waterfront.
And apparently it was unsafe, right?
It was unsafe. They should. So all the people who felt unsafe were right. And then they went through millions of dollars effort to reshore it, and then realized that that hadn't worked and closed it again. And meanwhile, I'm like, okay, the bridge is back open, put it back in the, and then I was like, take the bridge out, take the bridge out. So this, I'll give you a good view of that bridge as they're working on it here. You can see all those braces trying to secure the bridge. But look how it weaves through the buildings. It was just such a beautiful structure, and I'm glad they have reopened it now.
It's up again, so people can enjoy it right now. Yeah,
it's much more stable. I'll quickly go through. Here's the old Brooklyn Eagle office, and this is what it looks like today. Completely rebuilt over, except for this back section, which you can see on the right-hand picture. There's a line in the corner where you can see this like brickwork, where they basically built the building over the other building. And this is where the composing room was. And it was very unclear to me. And one of the parts of researching, going back, figuring, I thought that like, this was where Whitman wrote, right? And then I learned that no, this building was built over the building where Whitman worked. And then this building was built over that building. So there's this kind of layering just within this one building that I thought was incredible.
There's still the plaque in the front. They get a lot of mileage out of that plaque, and they're beautiful. There's actually two plaques, I think, to Whitman just to the left of the door.
In the final slides I have, I just love this old picture of the Plymouth Church.
Wow.
Before they built the big kind of facility next to it, but it's really a great picture. And here's the statue that I had been referring to. Here's Henry Ward, who was a complicated figure. He did a lot of abolitionist work, and he would hold slave auctions where he would sell the freedom of the slave, and people would contribute towards freeing different people. And so he did great work, but he also got embroiled in an affair with one of his members of his church, and that brought him much disrepute at the end of his life. But you can also see the kind of slouched figure of Lincoln there too. So it's
and that to the
very
right,
interesting.
That's Pinky, I think, one of the slaves that he auctioned off on the block to raise money for her freedom.
Yes.
I remember. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's thus named Pinky because someone had allegedly deposited a ring into the collection dish, which he wed her to her freedom in this big spectacle. And this was kind of the oratory style of Beecher, was that he would do these big productions of the time. He had them build the pulpit of the church so it went out into the crowd, so he could feel immersed amongst the people gathered there around him, and kind of create this almost theatrical experience, something Whitman, I think,
he wrote about
borrowed a little bit, but also accused Beecher of borrowing from Leaves of Grass. So it's a kind of fun.
I don't know about that, but I do know that he listened to Beecher and this is the age of great oratory, right? And if you look at poem titles like Song of Myself, I mean, Whitman's always talking about just being very oral. Hey, we have 5 minutes. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
I left time for you. I think we can. Is
Okay,
there?
I'm going to show, can I
Yeah,
show
I
people
want
my
you to
slide?
show. Yeah,
I
I don't
just,
think we've gotten any questions. Tristan,
so,
no questions. Let's see your slides instead.
all right. Well, I'm going to just take people through a few of my favorite shots, and let me see if I can move us over here. Um, and I just adore my students, so I'm going to show them off a little bit. This is my Whitman and New York class, which I've been teaching for 20 years up at Columbia. And what's really wonderful is you can see, well, we're on the Fulton Ferry Landing. We're just about to do this big tour, but you can see the woman in a wheelchair in the front. This was the first year that I had a student that was wheelchair bound. And Jesse, I know you and I have talked about this issue of accessibility, but that's another really interesting challenge for a tour guide to think about. New York is not as accessible as you would think. And I really had to go over every curb, think about every approach. The approach to going across the Brooklyn Bridge, actually, you can do it by wheelchair. And I'll show you that we actually did get up there, but it is a long way around on Tillery Street. So it was a lesson to me about my own city and about those challenges of accessibility.
Such
Um,
a great point. And I mean, I had to think about all bodies too. The people who are, a 2 hour walk is not everyone's cup of tea, and it really makes you put yourself into the shoes of others and think about their experiences. I think that's a great point as we try to create these sharing and open experiences. It's always possible to leave someone out, and it's great. It's actually great to have to go back and try to work around those things. It makes us aware and it makes us better at what we're doing, I think.
yeah, and I think also, knowing great places to eat on the way to get a bite. Not to put in plugs for anybody, but we love Ample Hills, which is named after a line from Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and there's an Ample Hills ice cream right at the base of the Fulton Ferry Landing, which I make a point of asking Columbia or NYU to make sure that each of my students can get a cone. Um, but just because we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to cruise through these. This is a picture, a beloved image of one of my students, and what happens when you take people on the New York City subways to go down to do tours. I have my students do poetry recitations, and some of them actually choose to do them in public places. So here you see a student reciting on the New York City subway, and I can tell you that he actually made a couple of dollars doing that, right? So very fun. But all of these kind of fun, spontaneous things that happen on a tour, that's why I really love giving tours. It's
Yes.
it's a really different story if it is already digitized and you just kind of go through it as somebody has planned it. But if you actually bring people to places, and here you're looking at photographs of my students down in the space that was once Pfaff's Cellar near the
Yes,
corner of
right.
Bleecker and
Yeah.
Broadway in Manhattan. And this was a very storied bohemian bar. And here you see really fantastic images from, this is actually supposed to be me here, um, from Pfaff Cellar. And I just love that the people up at Hans let us in to go down into the cellar to kind of stand in that space where Whitman probably wrote the Calamus poems. So I just have different photos here of different places. As I said, I like to stop students on tours. And one of my favorite places to bring people when I'm taking them down to the South Street Seaport area on the east side of Manhattan is Bound and Company Stationers, which is part of South Street Seaport Museum. And here you're seeing a shot of, I think 2 years ago when I had that student in the wheelchair, they actually brought the printing press outside so she could do the printing demonstration that they had set up for the students. It started raining. Everybody persisted. Paper got wet, didn't matter. This is in front of Whitman's last standing home at 99 Ryerson Street. And on the left, you see a photograph that's very cherished by me because that was one of the years that we were actually invited inside of the building. There used to be a gentleman who sat on the stoop sometimes named Horatio Downs. Apparently he owned the building for some time. And that year he saw us coming and he said, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "Walt Whitman." And he said, "Come right in." So you see us wandering in to see this space where Whitman first wrote Leaves of Grass. He finished the book in that house in 1855. That house we're trying to landmark as part of the Whitman Initiative right now, because it represents in so many ways how Whitman kind of became America's poet. It's a very solid, straightforward working man's house, as you see, unembellished, just simple staircase. And at the base here is our beloved Greg Trupiano, who passed away this year. And actually to the right is Robin Pecknold, who's the lead singer of Fleet Foxes, who wound up writing songs about Walt Whitman after he took my course. And actually, this moment of going into the house was very magical for us. Just a few other things. We go through Fort Greene Park, and a lot of people don't know that this very tall martyr, the monument to the prison ships martyrs, a Revolutionary War monument that we have in the middle of the park, you can actually get in there. And here you see one of the park rangers, Chris Woods, just a lovely guy who's teasing my students about something at the top there that didn't exist. You see how worried they all look, but there was actually nothing going on up there. But it was very cool to go inside the monument. Back in the day, you used to be able to take a staircase up to the very top, which is a really tall lookout for Brooklyn and New York. And this is the cellar of the Plymouth Church. So this was apparently one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. Just super moving to stand in that space and imagine how many people sought freedom in there in the various spaces left and right. And a shot further out on Long Island in
Jane's Hill.
On the top of Jane's Hill. And I should really move these photos so you can see in that neighborhood, there's a lot of Whitman lore, and there's actually a Whitman graveyard there in a private backyard. And I'm not going to name the gentleman who let us into his private backyard to see it, but talk about generous. Just, you see all those people, they wandered through that backyard to see a very old Whitman cemetery. And there we are, a smaller group of my students at the top of Jane's Hill. That happens to be Jane herself at the top of that rock. I kid you not. That's Whitman's Palmanock. And I'm ending my slideshow with, I guess, we had planned, Jesse, to talk about the things that we had left out of tours or that we would do differently, especially now in light of the various happenings of this year. And this is a gorgeous handball wall, a mural painted on there in the Whitman housing projects in Fort Greene, just above Fort Greene Park. So the Whitman houses are named after Whitman because he lived up there from 1859 to 1862 on North Portland Avenue. But that's one area that, I just actually was part of a proposal to do something in the Whitman housing project, to sort of connect the history of the poet, or at least poetry, to that particular part of Brooklyn, which tends to be off the charts of tours, right? People don't know about the things going on in there. And just as in Whitman's day, poetry comes off the streets of New York, doesn't matter where you are. And I think that handball court wall with Walt Whitman love on it and family and spirit just says it all.
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations about that, and it's probably a whole other
I think we've
discussion. But I also feel like a lot has changed in how people are thinking about Whitman and how they're thinking about his connection to race. And the neighborhood is so vibrant and diverse that it's worth taking the time now to use him as a lens to look at those issues. I think, thinking about Plymouth Church, thinking about those neighborhoods, it's really an important time. And for Whitman's beautiful poetry and some of the comments he made that are surfaced, there is a real kind of on the street view of New York that we don't get from anybody else. And so we can use Whitman as a way to talk about these things. I think, we are just starting to uncover a lot of kind of growth out of this recent conversations about Whitman and race. And I think for those of you who didn't see our talk on the YouTube channel last week, there was just a great conversation between Matt Miller and Lavelle Porter discussing Whitman and race. And it was really it was just an incredible talk. And I urge you all to listen to that. And we don't have enough time to cover it. But one of the things I would like to go back into my tour and game and rethink that aspect a little bit more deeply about Whitman's connection to slavery and race. I think it's worth, as I ask you to think about your connection to Brooklyn, it just seems like a natural fit. We're walking through these incredible, diverse neighborhoods, and it's one of my favorite parts about New York City and why I love living here. So,
yeah, Whitman may take us into those neighborhoods, but he's not the last voice that we should hear, right? Great poetry starts here. Whitman started here, but there's a lot of poetry to be discovered in these places. So we've got to sign off. See, we
got to sign off.
I know. See, we could talk forever, guys.
About this.
Thank you so much for listening, everybody. Tristan, thank you so much for pulling the strings behind the scenes for us. Everybody, if you can, tune in live next Thursday, 6 o'clock for Jay Sherry's talk, and you can read more about that up at our website. Jesse, it is always a pleasure.
Karen, love chatting, and I'm so glad we did this, and to many more conversations and to many more walks around Brooklyn and all New York.
Oh, yeah, and we should say, just as a last footnote, that we do have, as Jesse mentioned at the beginning, if you go to our website, there is a list of some of the tours that you can view that Jesse has his game. You can find out more about his game. It's not properly a game, right? I keep using the word game.
It's okay. It has game characteristics.
As a characteristic, it's fun.
It's fun. It's supposed to be. Yeah.
And if there is an interest in doing a tour with us, either Jesse or myself, or in stereo, can you imagine both of us at the same time? That's crazy. Please do contact us at walt@waltwhitmaninitiative.org. You can read more about that on our website. We are very happy to talk with you about possible tours and to just benefit the Walt Whitman Initiative, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, a cultural activist organization. So we're really happy to chat with you about that, and happy to chat with each other. So I'm gonna stop doing that. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you so much. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
It is done.